Aloha, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you for joining us for Pacific Forum's fifth Comparative Connections Roundtable on the subject of China's foreign relations after the Party Congress. My name is Rob York, Director for Regional Affairs at the Pacific Forum and editor of Comparative Connections, a tri-annual e-journal of bilateral relations in the Indo-Pacific, as well as your MC and moderator for today's event. For those of you who are not familiar with the publication, Comparative Connections is published 3 times per year, providing timely analysis on key bilateral relationships across the Indo-Pacific. Every issue of Comparative Connections is made up of 13 regular chapters, plus 1 rotating chapter appearing once yearly, each authored by recognized specialists who review critical developments within a given relationship and assess their implications for regional security, U.S. interests, and the future of the region at large. Each chapter also includes a carefully curated chronology section that synthesizes the day-to-day policy developments, diplomatic exchanges, and bilateral engagements that outline the trajectory of each relationship. These chapter chronologies contribute to a running sortable chronology section of the website that dates back to the first issue of Comparative Connections in 1999. In addition to these analytical chapters and bilateral chronologies, the Comparative Connections website hosts 2 databases, a state visits database dedicated to tracking official visits by heads of state, and our multilateral forums database, which similarly tracks events that have been taking place at select high-level meetings. The various components of this site complement one another to provide users with a holistic understanding of each bilateral relationship's rich history, contemporary successes and challenges, and future areas for cooperation. A link to our most recent issue of Comparative Connections can be found in the chat box now. We apologize to those who were expecting Bonnie Glaser of the German Marshall Fund to be here today. Unfortunately, she had a late commitment that made it impossible for her to participate. So in her place, to discuss China's foreign relations for the 20th party, after the 20th Party Congress, we have our regularly scheduled guests who are the author of our Japan-China chapter, Dr. June Teufel-Dreyer. Dr. Dreyer is professor of political science at the University of Miami Coral Gables, Florida, where she teaches courses on China, U.S. defense policy, and international relations. See the chat now for her most recent chapter of Comparative Connections. Please also check the chat for her recent analysis of the CCP Party Congress published by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And after her, we will have our other speaker for today, who is the author of our India East Asia chapter, Dr. Satu Limaye. He is vice president of the East-West Center, serving concurrently as director of research and at the East-West Center in Washington. For his most recent chapter, please see the chat box now. I want to thank our distinguished speakers for being here today, and we look forward to your remarks and the fruitful discussion that will certainly follow. After our speakers' presentations, we will transition into a Q&A segment where we will welcome feedback and questions from the audience. So with our 2 distinguished speakers on China and the Indo-Pacific region will now proceed. They will be discussing recent trends in and prospects for Beijing's foreign policy. Coming on the heels of the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, our panel will offer insights into the future of China's relations with the U.S., as well as its neighbors in Asia. Now on to today's discussion. We will start with remarks from Dr. June Dreyer. So, June, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I suppose the question on everybody's mind is just what does the 20th Party Congress mean for the future? And the speech, which was half the length of Xi's last speech, the 19th Party Congress, it seems to me was quite long enough to give us quite a few clues to what were going on. And it struck me reading it that he was promising all things to all people, which of course is something that politicians do regardless of their political parties. But he was saying things like, we're going to protect the rights of entrepreneurs. And at the same time, we are going to have tighter control of the state sector. And that's going to be really difficult to do. And the other thing he was saying is that we're going to proceed with common prosperity. And common prosperity really implies a transfer of wealth from the more wealthy parts of the population to the poorer parts of the population. And that's going to be very, very difficult to do. As many people have pointed out, it tends to stifle innovation, because if you're not sure when your corporation is going to be censored or taken over by the government, or you're going to be forced to resign, or like Jack Ma, you temporarily disappear and then decide to leave the corporation and meanwhile give lots of money to charity kind of thing, that hardly encourages innovation. And then he also promised to curb pollution, which we all know is a huge problem. And I'm not sure it was a coincidence or it was planned, but at the very time the conference was going on, the World Bank came out with a study about how impossible it was going to be for China to achieve its goal of carbon neutrality by 2060. And it was, it's very interesting, put it that way. And if you have time to read the whole report, and it's downloadable free from the web, you will see that part of the problem is that these pollution controls will hurt the poorest segments of the population much more than the wealthier segments of the population, which again cuts into the idea of achieving common prosperity and redistributing wealth. Another thing he said is, this must have been really hard for his predecessor to listen to. When I took over 10 years ago, the situation was dire. There was waste, extravagance, hedonism, et cetera, corruption, and we've made great strides toward that. But at the same time, he says, the anti-corruption campaign will continue. And if I were Chinese and I were listening to statistics about how we arrested over 1 million people and put them in jail for corruption, I might be wondering if the campaign was doing any good. And further, another thing that happened was the complete evisceration of what was left of any rival faction. And this was the Communist Youth League, the CYL. And the last vestige of that was Premier Li Keqiang, who would have been old enough to serve on the Politburo Standing Committee for another term, and was not only dropped from the Politburo Standing Committee, he was also dropped from the larger Politburo. And then the person who had been widely thought to be in line for a future premiership, Hu Chunhua, he not only didn't make the Politburo Standing Committee, but the Politburo either. And he was also associated with the CYL. And finally, in the final humiliation, Xi's predecessor, Hu Jintao, was firmly escorted from his seat by 2 muscular-looking men, despite the fact that he didn't seem to want to get up and leave. And it was later said that he was ill and suffering, and that he gave no instance of looking ill or suffering beforehand. And again, he had been considered the head of the CYL. So now this leaves us with this gentleman, Xi Jinping, in charge of virtually everything. And he's been named not only to that, but head of small leading groups, et cetera. The economy is in really bad shape. I don't know if you've seen, this came out just yesterday, I think, Ruchir Sharma, whose track record of predicting the Chinese economy is really, really good, that China will not be able to catch up with the United States by 2060 or probably at any time ever. And he has a lot of statistics to prove it, including declining population and increasing debt levels and so on. And also, there's been a tremendous backlash against China and China's aggressive policies over the last 10, 12 years. And so you see the organization, the Quad, is solidifying somewhat, and the Five Eyes seems to be talking about including Japan. And then there is something called the Alliance for the Blue Pacific to mobilize against China's activities in the South Pacific. And so you see that she faces extreme headwinds. It's the economy, it's the debt, it's the population decline, it's the mortgage crisis, and of course, she also promised continuation of the COVID restrictions. So that's going to further depress economic growth. And I think I've talked more than I should have here, but she has his work cut out for him in the future. And since he now monopolizes all of power, it's kind of hard to see that anybody but Xi Jinping bears responsibility for any mistakes that happen. And it looks like there are a lot of possible mistakes on the horizon. Xi himself alluded to this 2 years ago when he said, beware of gray rhinos and black swans. And they're out there. And with that, I will leave you until the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dreyer. Now we will transition to our next speaker, which is Satu Limaye of the East-West Center. Dr. Limaye, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to join this panel. I'm sorry, of course, that Bonnie and Ralph can't be here, but delighted to join a panel with Professor Dreyer and, of course, with you, Rob. And welcome to all our guests who have joined online. Now, my topic is really in this theme of China's foreign relations after the Party Congress is to look at the India-China element of this. As Rob mentioned, I do cover annually the India-East Asia. So let me put on my timer here so I don't run over time. We're at a particular juncture, right? We're at 60 years since the October 1962 war. In fact, this month, 60 years ago, India and China fought a war that India lost. We're about 2.5 years since the June 2020 Galwan incident and associated incidents around the border dispute between India and China, which resulted in 20 deaths, shots fired, standoffs at multiple locations, and a longer standoff than has previously occurred, at least since 86-87 crisis. And of course, as June spoke about so eloquently and insightfully, the 20th Party Congress and what that means for the future of China's place in the world, China at home, and needless to say, China's relations around its region. Now, my one point is that while the 20th Party Congress clearly is a major event for a lot of issues, I will argue that it is not a particularly driving or changing event for the Sino-India relationship, which has dynamics that, as I tried to indicate, precede just this last week's events. In other words, relations have been bad over decades. They've gone through different phases. So what does that look like, that chronology? Well, we know that from the late 1950s, particularly since the Dalai Lama fled Tibet to India, Sino-Indian relations plummeted, leading to the October 62 war, the 86-87 crisis, decades before Xi Jinping took office, roughly 25 years of stability after the 1988 visit of then Prime Minister Rahul Gandhi to India. And then, of course, a kind of steadily more sustainably corrosive relationship after Xi Jinping took over, with military standoffs beginning in 2013, 2014, 2015, 2017, and of course, as I mentioned, most recently in June 2020. Now, that violence crossed many thresholds, as I indicated, and since then, what we've seen is very little favorable to Sino-Indian relations. We did see Wang Yi's visit in March 2020. There's a record high bilateral trade with India running a significant but slightly less awesome deficit. And there has been the September 2020 pullback agreement on the contested areas in the line of actual control. On the more negative, if you will, the negative side, meaning non-progress in the Sino-Indian relationship, no leader interactions since June 2020, and Prime Minister Modi did not meet with his counterpart President Xi on the SCO sidelines more recently. I think that was a couple of months ago. Now, those are all the contextual elements, both historically and more recently. But what has not changed? And I think this is important because, Rob, if I may say, I wrote a piece for you guys at Pacific Forum, if you can believe it, I date myself. In 2008, I wrote a PACnet called India and China. I believe it was called India and China, the Four Disconnects. And I revisited that piece as I prepared for today, just to see what it looked like and how off base I was, given the constant surprises that occur in world affairs. And I was surprised myself to see some of the disconnects very persistent. I argued then that China is ahead of India on nearly every important measure of social and economic development, and China's leverage, relevance, and role in geostrategic issues far exceeds that of India. I do not find much reason to change my assessment from almost, really almost 20 years ago, that they are very asymmetrical, and that disconnect bounds or limits or constrains Sino-Indian relations. The second disconnect is that China is a recognized nuclear weapon state and India is not, though I would admit that since the 98 tests and subsequently, in fact, India is something of a de facto, if certainly not de jure, recognized nuclear weapon state. It has particular resonance, this issue, for the bilateral Sino-Indian relationship, because when India conducted its nuclear weapon tests in 1998 and declared itself a nuclear weapons power, it used the threat from China as one of the explanations for why it took that course of action. Now, from the Chinese vantage point, and I'm trying to see how they might have seen that, India's nuclear tests may have had something to do with the downturn in relations, though I would note that that cannot be an excuse for Chinese assertiveness, because India's the downturn in relations in 2020, maybe even the mid 2013, 14, 15 era happened quite a bit after those nuclear tests. As we now know that subsequently, China and India went through a long period of declaring to each other that neither was a threat to each other. And this was a condition for, quote, normalizing or rebuilding the trust after India pointed to China as the cause and the threat that precipitated the nuclear test. Now, from my vantage point, while I understand those diplomatic dynamics, it seems to me a tacit Chinese victory to get India to climb down on the threat assessment, because it basically reframed what India had said into what China wanted said, which is that China is not a threat. So I just leave it there for consideration. But in terms of who won the diplomatic skirmish, I would say essentially Beijing got India to say, no, we're wrong. You're not really a threat anymore. Now, whether India cared that they had to make those new statements, given that they had kind of achieved de facto nuclear weapons recognition, I do not know, but I leave that there. The third disconnect, which I mentioned in 2008, related to the border and territorial dispute, and that is essentially threefold and hasn't also changed very much. First, China, which essentially was the victor in the 1962 October border war, is in no rush to settle the dispute, while India, the defeated party, seeks a resolution of the dispute. Second, China seeks bilateral relations with India on a broader basis rather than on the border basis. In other words, they put the broader relationship and kind of park the issue of the border. And finally, that they approached it quite differently, where India's persistent focus in the negotiations of the special boundary representatives, et cetera, was to focus on ground realities, while China emphasized guiding principles. And then finally, the other disconnect was in the bilateral economic relationship, leading to huge trade deficits between India and China, which in some sense has constrained India from joining regional economic arrangements, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, from which they dramatically withdrew negotiations at just before its conclusion. So where does that leave us? Where it leaves us is the four disconnects that I identified roughly 20 years ago prevail. There has been no fundamental change in the discussions on the core issue of the border, which is China arguing for broader over border and India arguing for border before broader. And that's kind of where they're stuck, in my view. So what does that mean for the future? I don't know. First of all, I want to be very clear and say, I don't know exactly what it means, given watching this trajectory over 6 decades and certainly the last 20 years. People have used all kinds of phrases. India and China have competitive engagement. They have competitive coexistence. Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale has talked about armed coexistence. I don't know. You can frame it any way you want, but my view is the relationship is not getting any healthier or happier, and nor is it likely to fundamentally break down, in part because both countries do not need a full-fledged war. I don't think seek a full-fledged war, and have equities in at least managing a relationship rather than leading to a full-scale conflict. So let me end there, and thank you for the time to present some initial thoughts, and I look forward to the discussion with colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to both of our speakers for their presentation. We will now transition to question and answer. We have a question in the chat from David Camru, who has asked, he says he has asked some of his Sinophone students to look into the documents and speeches of the Congress, and I'm awaiting some results, but did Europe, the EU, or Britain rate a mention as such? Or like Putin, has Xi Jinping contributed to the reemergence and reaffirmation of the West as the adversarial other? I believe this question would be a best fit for Dr. Dreyer.
Here. I read those speeches very carefully, and it seemed to me that there was a strenuous effort to avoid mentioning any countries. And what Xi Jinping said was that there were storms ahead, and he mentioned a growing climate of hostility. He at no point acknowledged that China had any role in responsibility for this, that anything it had done had induced this. And I sometimes wonder if the Chinese have just not written off Europe. You know, for years they were talking about setting up a multipolar world, and Europe, and in particular the EU, was one pole. The EU then included Great Britain. And then it was pretty clear all along that when push came to shove, even though the UK wanted to be friends with China to the extent of putting David Cameron, giving him a cushy job after he ceased to be prime minister, and okaying the Hinkley Point nuclear plant and various things like that, that when push came to shove, Britain was going to side with the United States, and that human rights were really important. And then, of course, Britain leaves the EU, and the reaction in the EU to Xinjiang, the PRC's action in Xinjiang, and even more so in Hong Kong, was horrified. And I think China has basically just written off Europe. It obviously wants to be friends. It had a lot of investments in Ukraine, which it must be concerned about, but it's not uppermost. And I'm also a little intrigued by, David's question mentioned the West, and the West seems to be including more and more countries. Japan is definitely become part of the West. And I know when I lived in Japan as a student, I thought it was uproariously funny that Japanese radio and TV always referred to those Asians as if Japan were not a part of Asia. And after I lived there for a while, I thought, they're right. It is. And then, so the West now includes Japan, and the West includes Australia and New Zealand, which of course are very south rather than necessarily west, but they're in Asia. And so it strikes me that Xi Jinping is not amiss when he talks about the hostile climate. But what is he willing to do to reduce that? Is he going to stop threatening in the South China Sea? Is he going to stop threatening in the East China Sea? Is he going to stop threatening Taiwan? And this incident last week with the Chinese consul in Manchester, actually, and his minions actually coming out of the gates of the consulate, which remember means leaving Chinese sovereign territory, to destroy posters and yank in a participant and beat him up. And then the Chinese consul he was on tape pulling the guy's hair, and he defends it later, saying that it was justified because the man was insulting his country and his leader. And this just doesn't go over well. And it's also a violation of international law, by the way. And so will China do something? I've noticed over the years that there is this shofang, you loosen policy and then you tighten policy depending on the circumstances. Satu, you have, Professor Lumaye, you have mentioned this with regard to the Sino-Indian border. Things get better and they get worse. And are things going to get better? Because what I see is a continuation of worse. So that's all I'm going to say.
Dr. Limaye, has there been notable rhetoric from Chinese officials, perhaps any notable Chinese officials or perhaps state media regarding India? And if so, what are your takeaways from it?
Yeah, and it relates both to Professor Dreyer's comments just now about things getting better or worse on the border, and then the question David Carl had about the former Indian ambassador, and then your question about India. I have seen no mention. Now, I just want to say, I probably haven't followed the 20th Party Congress with the care that Professor Dreyer and others have. Every statement, every document, every speech. I did watch the videos of the leading out Hu Jintao, and of course things that caught the attention. But I confess to not having seen one reference to India. And given what Professor Dreyer said about the few names of countries being mentioned, I would be surprised if India made it to that level of attention in a Chinese 20th Party Congress focused on such big issues as a third term for President Xi, et cetera. And I couldn't agree more with Professor Dreyer about the issue of the border. As I said, to me, there's no happy or healthy relationship between China and India forthcoming. And given the more frequent, persistent crises on the border, including the 2020 Galwan, which just got essentially partially disengaged in September, it's easy to put that stuff back into place and press forward on that in the coming months. I'm not sure in the winter months that we're getting into now, given, here we are in October and up there where Galwan is and Ladakh and that area, we're talking about very inhospitable conditions. But might there be a flare up in the spring or summer? I must confess, I expect there to be more flare-ups of the border between Sino-Indian relations. Exactly what is the driver of them, I do not know. But both sides seem to me now not in the mood, unlike in the previous period, as I mentioned, 25 years of a kind of roughish detente, where they went out of their way to pull back and say that it's because the line of actual control was not well demarcated and therefore they may have gone, all those kinds of diplomatic coverings. I don't think you're going to see that anymore. I think you're going to just see more skirmishes and more people calling the one side and the other, calling each other out directly in more stand your ground kind of ways. And that, of course, creates a certain amount of dangers for the situation. And David Carl, I did not see the Gautam Bambawala piece. But again, my assessment of the situation would track with expectations that there would be more tensions on the border.
Okay, before we take any additional questions, we have been joined by Pacific Forum's President Emeritus Ralph Cosa, who has also been following the developments at the Party Congress and who also has some impressions to share. So Ralph, the floor is yours.
Rob, thank you very much. And my apologies for coming in so late. We had a power outage here in our building, so that's out of my control, I guess. Anyway, I apologize since I didn't hear what the other two had to say. I have read a lot of what June has been writing, and I agree with everything of it. So I'll try not to repeat what I think she said. I think the main point that I would like to make, the main takeaway for me on the 20th Party Congress, is that Deng Xiaoping thought is now officially dead. The last nail has been put in the coffin. And essentially all of the principles and policies put forth by Deng to bring China to where it is today have now been reversed. We're not just talking about the collective leadership, which is the final nail in the coffin, and the new Mao that Deng wisely guarded against. It started with the hide your strength, bide your time, which was replaced by wolf warriors, and China is a big country and you're not. The phase out of state-owned enterprises has now turned. It still doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it subscribes to Xi Jinping thought, as opposed to as long as it catches mice. So this was, again, another thing. One country, two systems has now been completely discarded. And June, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there was even a mention of one country, two systems in any of the Xi comments this time. And normally they would at least, perfunctorily throw that out. But I think they understand it's no longer a model or relevant. Taiwanese came to that conclusion a long time ago, but there was at least an attempt to stand by those principles, and that's gone. And now the whole idea of collective leadership is gone, and Xi has put in place essentially 6 yes men who are going to essentially give him a free rein. Now the good news for Xi is that he can get away with whatever he wants. The bad news is he has to accept responsibility for everything that happens. And in particular, if they can pull off the economic miracle or continue the economic progress, now that it not only doesn't matter what color the cat is, the cat had better not think that getting rich is still glorious, because if you're rich, you have a big target painted on your back. And we've seen that in the last 6 months as well. So I think Xi, I've written before that I thought Xi was tactically clever but strategically foolish. Deng said, hide your strength, don't let people know just how powerful we are. Xi goes out of his way to wave a sword, and the result has been AUKUS, and the result has been the Quad, and the result has been a lot more countries worrying about U.S. staying power and wanting the U.S. To remain engaged. So I think that while tactically he's gotten the people in Hong Kong quiet, he's also reminded the Europeans and everyone else that any piece of paper that China signs is essentially useless, even if it's an international treaty registered at the UN. So my feeling is that Xi is now firmly in control. We were looking for, some non-Xi person to end up in the Politburo or some checks and balances. I don't think we saw that. But I really think that the guy is just not a strategic thinker and has essentially been our best friend as far as rallying the rest of the world to remind them about China. The only thing that's missing is an invasion of Taiwan. I don't foresee that coming in the near future, but I think they're going to continue to put a lot of pressure on Taiwan. As I came in, we were talking a little bit about Xi's aggressiveness, and I would say the conclusion that I've reached, and I think most of the people I've talked to have reached, is that now that he has this firm control, he is not going to ease up. He is going to be more aggressive, more provocative, wave an even bigger stick, which raises both the prospects of accidents, even if we not looking for a war, but also I think will raise the prospects of other countries rallying against or hedging against China, and that's what we in the United States need to take advantage of. So let me stop there. Again, I apologize if I repeated what everyone else has already said.
Oh, no, not at all. Thank you for joining us and for those remarks. June, I'll turn the next question to you. There have been a lot of talk about Xi Jinping as the new Chinese emperor and comparing him to previous dynasties. But being a historian rather than a political scientist, something that I remember from studying the Chinese emperors is that on many occasions they faced considerable bureaucratic opposition at times. And it's been speculated that, in fact, Xi may not be limited in that regard. He might actually be more powerful than the ancient Chinese emperors. What is your take on that? Are there any domestic obstacles to Xi's agenda now?
None that we can consider seriously. And we can tell that there is opposition rumbling among what I would call the chattering classes in China, but they can't chatter very much anymore because of the censorship. But every so often you get a very brave kind of thing. And about 5 years ago, there was someone who wrote under a pen name. And, Chinese often do this. Rather than criticize overtly, you use history to criticize. And he talked about an ancient emperor who surrounded himself with yes men, and they told him what he wanted to hear. And the result was that the empire fell apart and the emperor was deposed. And he was clearly speaking to Xi Jinping there. And then there was also a round robin letter signed by 22 important people who actually signed their names, worrying about the cult of personality. And then there's a guy he was a policy advisor in China to, I think, Zhu Rongji, and he's now at Stanford. And he wrote a scathing indictment of Xi Jinping for using language which I would not want to use on a national television, something nationally televised, but it had to do with excrement, put it that way. And so we know that there is this rumbling of discontent. And we know from the fact that after this fella, it draped his banner from the bridge in Beijing, there were posters put up surreptitiously all over China and also at universities around the world. Many of them, actually, some of them from the University of Miami, some of them at George Washington University. I don't know about the rest of the country, but there were some. And at Wellesley, that supporting this guy, saying, we don't want these COVID lockdowns. We don't want to be slaves. Xi Jinping should go. So the resistance is there. And I'm reminded of the situation in the United States in 1979, where American television, and I was in Washington at the time, I had security clearances, I saw all kinds of interesting things, I didn't see anything about resistance to the Shah. Nothing. The Shah would go somewhere, enthusiastic crowds would say, "We love you, our Shah." And a couple of weeks later, there are riots and demonstrations, and the Ayatollah Khomeini comes back triumphantly. So, in other words, are we getting the whole picture? And our media is not necessarily telling us what's going on. I mean, they do their best, but especially in China, they are heavily censored from what they could say. And so I also remember more recently that nobody seemed to think that Ukraine would last a week after Putin invaded, and that hasn't turned out to be the case. So we may be deceiving ourselves again. And I see Ralph getting agitated, so I'll shut up. Ralph?
First, I agree with everything that June said. One of the points, when we used to be able to go to China 3 or 4 times a year, we would have great walks in the park, if you will, with friends who, once they got out of their office, would tell you what they really thought. The last 2 years, every Chinese that I've talked to, at least, has been via Zoom. And every Chinese I've talked to via Zoom was aware that someone was listening. And as a result, all you heard was the party line. So you didn't get that, little walk that says, Xi Jinping is obstinate and stubborn and doesn't listen to anybody but himself, and he won't take good advice, and he's leading us in the wrong direction. I mean, these are things I heard 2 years ago. But quite frankly, we don't know what people are thinking now, because we really haven't had a chance to talk with them. They're certainly not going to tell us what they're thinking over Zoom. So until things open back up and we can get back in country and talk to people privately outside of their offices, somewhere in the park where you don't have to talk into the tree trunk, it's going to be very hard to really get a good feel for what people are really thinking.
Dr. Lim, I don't presume that there is a single view in India toward China, but I am wondering if you've heard any notable reactions to the power consolidation in China, and is there a sense that this might bode ill, even greater ill perhaps, for China-India relations? And I don't necessarily mean just the power consolidation at the party Congress, but the general process that we've seen.
Yeah, India is a big country, and I'm sure there's lots of views, but it is fair to say that the public opinion polling, let's take public opinion polling, I think the elite have certainly hardened on China. That's very evident in, as I've described, over the last 2-3 years, maybe even several years, no question about it. In my experience, and again, because of COVID, haven't been to India in 3 years. So people haven't been to China for some time. I haven't been to India for minimum since 2019. I can't remember, but certainly not since late 2019. And the point is that public opinion has become very negative towards China. But I have not seen any direct comparisons of China versus Pakistan as India's threat. But I do want to make the point that given the more, shall we say, nationalistic tones of the Modi government, there can be much harder lines against Pakistan than there can be sometimes, I discern, about China. Both are hardened. And in fact, some of you will have seen Tanvi Madan's article in Foreign Affairs called China Has Lost India. I'm not sure India was anything to be lost by China. I'm not sure that framing, but I don't know if she chose the title or Foreign Affairs. Sometimes publications choose titles. My point is, I still think that the elite public government officials will seek, they've hardened their position on China because what China has done over the last several years, long before the Party Congress, not least because of the border, but they're not going to try to mismanage the relationship into conflict. That didn't work out well in October 62. And I'm not sure the Chinese want, the Indians would like to try that again in 2023 or 2024 or 2025. So hardened position, more suspicion, more joining on to Japan, Australia, US via the Quad, more efforts to work with the US, all true, but keeping some calibration in managing the India-China relationship. Now, in a broader context, this is not terribly different from many countries across the Indo-Pacific, notwithstanding Chinese assertiveness. I've argued, including in testimony to the US-China Security and Review Commission, that overall the structural trends point to exactly what Ralph said. Chinese assertiveness driving closer alliance relations, more partner relations for the US because of Chinese behavior. It does not logically follow that anyone is looking for a war or conflict with China themselves or between the US and China. But definitely China's coercion, economic coercion, its territorial and historical assertiveness, its increasingly strong authoritarianism has created deep concerns within the region and certainly India. Now I'm going to throw one thing out at you. Depending on how the Indian polity develops over the next decade or two, more nationalistic, more populist, more chauvinist, meaning Hindu nationalist. You know, there are views that the real fight is not between India and China, that they can stay calibrated across the Himalayas, that except for the border, there's not a big issue, that there could be an X variable of the US pulling out or pulling down its role in the region. You know, one can build scenarios where you can think that it might not be Hindi Chini bye-bye. And it might not be India and China as best friends, but sort of this disengaged relationship that they had for centuries, where their worlds didn't really collide. India didn't continue to asymmetrically grow vis-a-vis China and stuck to South Asia. Now, I'm just throwing this out there partly as provocation and partly as interest, because it's possible on the one spectrum of the scenario that it won't. As I very clearly stated, I believe the China-Sino-India relationship is not going to get healthier and not going to get happier. But there is that spectrum 20, 30 years out under different scenarios where you could posit different alternative futures for the Sino-Indian relationship.
Okay, June.
I'm provoked. You said you threw that out for provocation. And I would argue that China has been fantastically successful with its salami tactics. And you mentioned the border on the Himalayas. And one thing I think we haven't mentioned is the Indian Ocean. And I think China will continue its provocations in the Indian Ocean. And if India does not respond, and clearly building a new aircraft carrier was part of a response, but it's only a signal. It hasn't meant anything, but that there could be an unwanted escalation, not just on the border, as there was at Galwan, but also in the Indian Ocean. And I see this happening every day. I read the Japanese newspapers, or at least I read 5 of them every day. And you can see this provocation, the salami tactics. Practically every day, there are more fishing boats and more Chinese Coast Guard boats, which are armed to the extent that they look like Navy ships. It's just that they have white hulls instead of gray ones, surrounding the area, almost amoeba-like. And the Japanese they're very hesitant to respond because of what happened in September 2010, and in which the Japanese government handled very badly. And they don't want anything like that to happen again. So at each point, it seems to me, definitely the Japanese government and possibly the Indian government always says, we can manage this, we can manage this, we can manage this. But they're giving up the initiative and the territory. Like when the Chinese come across the border in the Himalayas and say, we're building a road through here because it's ours, and then have to be shoved back. And so far that's worked, but suppose one day it doesn't. So I'm, everybody who knows me knows that optimism is not my shtick. But here I can't be optimistic. I have to be pessimistic about all the possibilities for the unwanted escalation. And you mentioned perceptions in India. Is it India versus Pakistan or India versus China? And I wonder if many Indians don't regard the Pakistan and China not as separate entities, but as cooperating partners there. So it's not an either or, it's to what extent are they going to cooperate?
Yeah, that's a great point, June. I mean, I got to tell you, many people, that's getting more and more fused because of Chinese assertiveness. Mm-hmm. But I would say that the broad public in India is catching up to the China assertiveness. Mm-hmm. But I would say that the visceral salience of Pakistan, especially in a Hindu nationalistic India, Pakistan still plays. And I see that in my WhatsApp groups and chat groups and others. It's really extraordinary. Yes, there's occasional mentions, but China often seems, I'm surprised how far. Now, I don't dispute with you in the larger Indo-Pacific region, as I've stated, it's certainly driven more structural improvements in US-Iraq, US-Japan, US-Australia, even US-New Zealand. Certainly Singapore has upped its agreements with us as a strategic non-ally partner in many ways. But I am constantly surprised, a little befuddled, that China's historical and territorial assertiveness does not create more backlash. I had an opportunity to talk in Washington recently, very senior Indonesian former official. And I said, what gives with the Chinese claims 2,000 miles away to the EEZ of Natuna? And if you look at what they've done in Malaysia and what they've done in Natuna, and except for the Philippines, even there, extraordinarily, it still doesn't seem to resonate as much as I would think a territorial and historical claim of the kinds China's making do. So I'm not going to suggest that people don't, but I also put in the chat, I would mention your point about the Indian Ocean. I think Admiral McDivitt has published on this too, and has stated that at some point we can expect a regular presence of aircraft carrier battle groups of China in the Indian Ocean. I don't want to misquote him, but there's analysis, and here's Samir Lalwani, who's joined the U.S. Institute of Peace, his piece on the PR3 threat to the Indian Ocean. So I think, India still has enormous advantages given its geography and given its place in the Indian Ocean. But clearly China's expansion, its movement out and about, is bringing challenges that are only going to grow. And India will have to decide sort of, I think, in my view, what it wants to do about that. What its relations with Japan, as you mentioned, with Australia, with US, with the EU, which is Europeans are getting a little bit more interested in Indo-Pacific. How much, how far, how deep, in what ways, I remain questioning, but you could see the German Indo-Pacific strategy, including the update that they issued last month, including joining at UNGA, the Blue Partners of the Pacific effort. So there's clearly some more interest and bandwidth in Europe for responding to China as well.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from our WSD Hand of Fellow, Jake Steiner, who said, Ralph's comment on not knowing what the Chinese people really think had me reconsider the zero COVID policy. Could we consider the control that zero COVID provides, such as forcing the Chinese public to talk on Zoom where someone's listening, as a contributing factor to the persistence of the policy? And how, if at all, would this affect the resistance that Professor Dreyer mentioned beyond the short term? So, Ralph, how about you?
Well, I don't think the primary reason for the zero COVID policy is so that Ralph Costa can't talk to Chinese scholars. But I think that's sort of an added benefit, if you will. I think that the main reason that they're sticking with the zero COVID policy is because Xi Jinping is incapable of acknowledging that he's made a mistake, and no one else is prepared to point out that he's made a mistake. And as a result, they're going to live with it, whether it's a good idea or not. I do think one of the effects of it, though, has been to limit the kind of interaction that those of us who try to understand what's happening in China seek. But I wouldn't think that they were that clever as to be doing it for that reason. But particularly since there was some. Have been and continue to be some severe economic consequences involved. But again, I think what it shows is that she puts sort of instant gratification, if you will, first, and that he's more worried about his image, and I guess feels pretty comfortable that he can survive with a lower GDP growth rate than. Many had predicted, June remembers, Satu, I'm sure as well, when everyone used to predict that, China couldn't survive if it had less than 8% GDP growth, that the whole country was going to fall apart. Well, hello, it's been below that, and God knows what the real number is, but even the numbers that they provide show were lower than that, and yet there's no serious problem as far as we can see. So I think that there are a lot of effects to it. I think the main impact of the zero COVID, however, is really on the health of the Chinese people. If they opened up more, first of all, it would show that the Chinese vaccines are pretty ineffective. Because a lot of people who have been double vaccinated and everything. So I think that's probably also a factor in why they don't want to open up. I think we should be spreading a rumor that when Xi went to the Quad meeting, that he immediately asked for a Pfizer booster shot, because he probably did, and we just don't know about it. But those are the kind of things we ought to be, reminding people. Well, maybe you're not opening up because you have no faith in your vaccination policy and your vaccine. Sort of let's. I don't want to call it a disinformation campaign because it might actually be accurate information, but it at least will be counter to Chinese disinformation campaign.
I have heard that Xi Jinping might not have as much faith in the Chinese healthcare system as some of his leftist supporters, at least online, do. But June, do you have any thoughts about the control imposed by COVID-19 policies and how that is affecting the ability to resist?
I'm sorry, the ability to resist what? Xi Jinping?
Yes.
Yeah. The ability to resist Xi Jinping, I think he's making himself more problems than he needs to. And it would be better for him if he eased up on these restrictions. And yet he seems very reluctant to do so. And this is hurting business as well, because one of the things in Xi's speech is he's welcoming foreign investors. And foreign investors have been very skittish about going into China, partly because of this 10-day quarantine thing, and partly because of the mess that the whole supply chain issue has done. And meanwhile, countries that have become hostile to China are making it easier to reshore things. I know Japan has just announced, actually it's about 2 weeks ago, a stimulus to get their companies to reshore to Japan. And some of them are also they're reshoring, but not to Japan. They are going to Vietnam and to India. And Professor Yumai will know more about that than I do, but I'm sure the Indian government is delighted to have them. These are Japanese corporations and electric cars and so on. So I think Xi is shooting himself in the foot here. And I would go back to applauding what Ralph Casa said earlier, that he is tactically smart, but strategically being very stupid. And so the effort to impose too much control may end up disintegrating the control in the long run. And Rob York, you mentioned at the beginning, does he have the power of old Chinese emperors? And with artificial intelligence and remote sensing and things like that, you may think he has more power. But on the other hand, China has some absolutely brilliant hackers. And so essentially the government is playing a cat and mouse game with them. And I wouldn't count the Chinese hackers out. And I don't know if any of them are following, but they can't mention Xi that's been excised from the digital media. And so what they refer to as Comrade 11, Roman numeral 11 is XI. You see what I mean? They're awfully smart. And there are enough of them that they must drive the censors bananas, but they keep being inventive about, and I'm sure it's fun for them. So yes, in some ways he has more control than the ancient Chinese emperors, but on the other hand, he has a very determined and well-educated opposition. And there is also the problem of, the debt problem. It's huge. So local banks weren't able to give people their money. And you have a mortgage crisis. People are refusing to pay mortgages. So the central government steps in and says to these banks, give these developer corporations money so that they continue building apartments. What does that do? It's a shell game. You see what I mean? And it's making the national debt worse. So at some point, the yogurt is going to hit the fan on this. And as a matter of fact, at the 2017 Party Congress, the head of Chinese Central Bank, obviously a patriotic man who was a member of the Chinese Communist Party, talked about a Minsky moment. I didn't know what a Minsky moment was. You all know what a Minsky moment is? No. I had to look it up. I grew up in New York, and Minsky was the burlesque theater owner of the time. However, this is a different Minsky, and he's an economist. And it's when a rapid expansion reaches the point where the expansion can't continue anymore. So think of it as a balloon. You can keep blowing it and it's going to pop. And it seems to me that China's getting close to that with this Evergrande default and the other developers, and you can't keep playing that shell game forever. So I'm not sure if the Chinese emperors, my late husband was the historian, and I'm sure he could tell you just which empires disintegrated because of it. But there are definite comparabilities here. And I don't think Xi's position is as all powerful as some of us think it is. And I bet you Ralph would agree with that.
Speaking of Ralph, and I think this will be the last round of questions that we have, but earlier in the year, he wrote about how China's rather tepid reaction to the Ukraine invasion was eventually going to be seen as a great strategic blunder for Xi Jinping, because for one thing, while they have been ardent champions of their own territorial integrity, they were standing by and doing nothing while Russia violated the territorial sovereignty of their neighbor quite blatantly. So, given all that has transpired since then, what do you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine means for China's position? Not only the invasion, but China's reaction to it. What does that mean for China's role in the region?
Uh, Thanks, Rob. That's a great question. I mean, what I had argued was if Putin wants to reestablish the Russian Empire, which for all intents and purposes seems to be what he's intending to do, part of that empire is Central Asia, which the Russians call the Near Abroad. And if you look at maps since Peter the Great, the Russians have expanded into Central Asia, then sort of contracted, then expanded again and expanded again. So at some point, Putin's not going to be able to continue going toward Europe. And the soft underbelly is the area where I've argued the great game of the 21st century may end up being Russia versus China in Central Asia. So they're a little bit short-sighted there. I would say the same thing about the Iranians, quite frankly, because there are parts of Armenia and Azerbaijan that are in Iran today. And certainly the Russians would like to be back on that border, which is why there was no love lost in the olden days. The Shah used to look to the United States because of his concern about the Russian threat, not because of any other threat. So I think it's been very, very short-sighted. What I found fascinating is we did a Zoom dialogue with a group of Shanghai scholars talking about Ukraine. And the scholars were very negative toward, they thought that Russia had made a strategic blunder in invading Ukraine. And they also said, which I found very fascinating, that Russia is fighting a 20th century war in Ukraine, while NATO is fighting a 21st century war. NATO is not firing a shot, but it's very much at war with the Russians, and it's doing it through economics, it's doing it through surrogates. I thought, A, that was very insightful, but B, what are the Chinese lessons learned from all of this? We've focused a lot. I've been doing work on Taiwan, and the Taiwanese, are certainly trying to learn the lessons of Ukraine. But I think the Chinese are also trying to learn the lessons of Ukraine and trying to figure out, well, if U.S. sanctions and U.S. economic approach has been successful, how do we get around that? How do we defeat that when the time comes for us to do something against Taiwan that will cause the West to try to do the same things to us? So I think that as we study the lessons learned in Ukraine, we need to understand that the Chinese are studying the lessons learned, and the Chinese are going to be taking steps to counter what we were able to effectively do against the Russians. So we need to know the counters to their counters, if you will. So to me, that's sort of the study about lessons learned in Ukraine that we haven't done yet. Is that what are the Chinese learning? How are the Chinese responding to what they're learning? And what do we need to do in order to continue to be effective fighting a 21st century war, if it comes to that, in the Taiwan Strait against China?
Thank you. Satu, do you have any thoughts on that topic?
No, I really don't. I think, at least I perceive China as modulating its position a little bit from the initial response, which was essentially recognizing the naked aggression of Russia. But I don't think it's fundamentally changed at all. I think they sought some kind of maybe a little cover or space. But I do think the issue is raised is what next for Russia, China? That to me is a really huge issue. We've had a number of assessments of this from National Bureau of Asian Research, many other places. And I get very mixed signals. I don't follow this closely, but very mixed signals about what the future portends. I cannot believe that tactics aside, Russia can be comfortable with a rising China of the level and assertiveness and aggressiveness. You'll recall at some point, Ralph, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it was my understanding that the late Prime Minister Abe's position on Russia was in part predicated on the notion that Russia might be, I wouldn't say a counter or anything such so grandiose, but in sort of at least, used to be called sometimes, I used to joke in US relations with India and Pakistan, or India in particular, a weenie strategy. You wean India away from Russia. You wean India away. And did Abe-san have that kind of thinking about maybe we can't have Russia on our side, to be sure, but could we at least not make sure that it consolidates its relationship with China? And I do think that's an interesting issue going forward. And I know Comparative Connections covers that issue, but I don't really have, I really can't see into that crystal ball as to what next, but I can't believe Moscow can be happy about China's a huge power.
Okay, and I'll leave June with the last word.
Okay. I remember that initiative. Let me lower my hand here. I remember that initiative by Abe, and it didn't go very far because there were numerous reasons, but one of the very important things is what Russia wants is a peace treaty from World War II. And that peace treaty would have to cede the so-called Northern Islands, meaning the southern Kurils from the Russian point of view, to Russia. And there would be no way that Abe could remain prime minister because of public opinion on that matter. So he couldn't really give the Russians what they want. And it is not widely understood, but there are 4 groups of islands involved. And back from the days when Stalin was in charge, the Russians have offered to give back 2 of those, but not all 4. And the political makeup in Russia it precludes giving back those other 2 islands because they're strategically important. And the Russians know their history very well. And they remember what the horrible defeat that the Tsarist fleet suffered in the Straits of Tsushima back in 1905. And they ain't going to take that chance again. So that initiative was a non-starter from the get-go.
All right, and with that, I will thank each of our 3 speakers for their comments and for their interaction with our questions, especially for taking time to share their insights with us. I want to offer a special thanks to Ralph for transitioning from the moderator's role to a speaker's role on short notice. And I want to thank the rest of the speakers for bearing with us through all the formatting changes as well. So thanks again to everyone who has shown up, who has participated, and who has submitted questions and contributed to this discussion. I'm confident that those of you who joined us today gained from the discussion as well. If you are not familiar with Comparative Connections or have not yet taken time to read it, this is the quality of analysis that you can expect with each issue. We will publish our next issue on January the 15th, which you can view by visiting our website at cc.pacforum.org. You may download the entire issue in PDF form at the top of the page, as well as download individual chapters or simply read them online. We hope that you will read Comparative Connections, cite it in your own work, and spread the word. If you want to support the journal, support more events like this, and help us grow, please contact our development team at development@pacforum.org. We have a range of sponsorship options that can help you to help us. Thank you all once again, and we will see you in the near future. Stay well and stay safe.
Aloha.